This is God's Hand in History, brought to you by Mr. Mac.
This is Mr. Mac, once again coming to you at podcast number 2 from God's Hand in History, and we're going to be talking about today a biblical parallel between America being a promised land in these latter days and Israel that went to their promised land in the former days. We consider the time frames in relation to Israel's exodus from Egypt, and it seems coincidental that when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, it was about 1450 BC. Prior to that time, he'd spent 40 years in the desert after he had fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian overseer that had been beating a slave. If we add those 2 years together, it comes to a time when he returned to take the Israelites out of Egypt, and left was about 1492 when he had left to go to the Midian desert. 1492 BC, when they began the flight from Egypt, which would lead Israel to the Promised Land. What happened in 1492 AD? This is the time that Christopher Columbus decided to cross the Atlantic, since Queen Isabella of Spain had decided that she was going to gather up all of the Hebrews in Spain and put them on ships and ship them to Egypt to sell them as slaves. It just happened that Christopher Columbus was Hebrews. In our talks with an historian in the Azores, the Portuguese Azores, he told us that Columbus wrote all of his diaries in Hebrew. He and Americus Vespucci were Hebrews, and they realized that when Isabella of Spain was going to take all the Hebrews away, that he'd be captured also. One reason he had only one big ship, the Santa Maria, from the Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria. The Santa Maria was the only big ship because Queen Isabella had already caught all of the big ships and moved them down where she was going to gather up the Jews and send them to Egypt. Well, at that point, King John of Portugal, who was a friend of Columbus, said, on this certain night at 12 o'clock, Isabella is going to gather everybody up. So at 11:30 that night, Columbus and Americus Vespucci got on their ships and they sailed away. Columbus normally would have sailed down to the Canaries, which would have been the normal route to take to the Caribbean, but he decided instead to go straight west and go to the Azores. And Isabella, knowing that Columbus had sailed out, sent a fleet after him, and they went down towards the Canaries. Of course, they didn't catch him there. So that's when he left on that night to flee to America to discover the new land. This wasn't something that was him discovering it. He already had the maps. The maps of the entire world had been delivered by the Chinese to the Vatican in 1438, about 70 years beforehand. So he knew there was going to be a continent over there. He knew that if he landed, he'd be landing on the narrow part of the continent, and he thought he could have a quicker route to get across to the Chinese area and get to the Spice Islands if he needed to. But mainly, he realized there was a new continent there, and he wanted to take the gospel to the people there, the people who were God's people there in the American continent. In Spanish, is los gente en Dios, God's people that are there. So that's where they came out. Los indios are those in Dios, those who are in God. When he got there, he was able to land in the islands, and he was able to then establish the first Jewish settlement was in those islands, settled there by Americus Vespucci. In Columbus landing in the Caribbean, that was the very start of Europeans beginning to settle in North and South America. What would happen after this is that when Christians were being oppressed in Europe, it would be a foothold for them to come over and be in that new country. The Pilgrims and the Puritans would try to leave the oppression that was in Europe at this time to be in a place that God had prepared for them so that they could start a new land based clearly on biblical principles. And next time, I want to talk to you about that, how that land was established. We're going to start next time with the first miracle that God performed to get us to establish a Christian foothold on North America. We'll see you next Monday. This is Mr. Mack for God's Hand in History. You guys be blessed. See you next week.